CATLICK fans, what's up? We're about to dive into this crazy theory about W.H. Mitchell. I'm going to be unpacking a ton of fascinating details. The good news, I've got a visual explainer all packaged up for you at our website, and it's free. To see it for yourself, just go to catlick.com/Atlanta Ripper. Again, that's catlick.com/Atlanta Ripper. Enjoy the episode. I never would have discovered this whole crazy William Mitchell Lucille Linton kidnapping saga had it not been for one small article printed in a New York newspaper in 1909. You'll remember that after William H. Mitchell was convicted of abducting and assaulting Lucille Linton, his lawyers filed multiple appeals that eventually escalated to the governor of Georgia. But Governor Joseph Mackey Brown refused to overturn the ruling. Shortly after, this small article about Governor Brown's refusal to give clemency appeared in the New York Age newspaper in 1909. The New York Age was a successful African-American newspaper in circulation from the late 1800s to the mid-1900s. The article begins with a quick summary. A Georgia man named W.H. Mitchell donned blackface and attempted to abduct a prominent white lady. It then praises Governor Brown for not letting Mitchell off the hook, but it scorches the people of Georgia, saying, quote, "For 40 years, Georgia has Ku Kluxed innocent Negroes," end quote. Then the writer makes a hard pivot. Here it is. The question naturally arises, how many of the big, burly Negroes accused of rape are black-faced brutes of the white race? How many of the 100 Negroes lynched and the thousands more imprisoned last year in the South were innocent? Crimes, like chickens, come home to roost. Neither race pride nor race prejudice can suppress the truth any longer. There are many phases of Southern character of which for years we have contended the nation knows little or nothing. The black-faced brute is one of them. He's basically saying two things here. One which is a bit of conjecture, and one which, 100 years later, we certainly know to be true. What's true is that between the Civil War and civil rights, scores of black people were unjustly killed for petty offenses or crimes they didn't even commit. This is mind-numbingly tragic and has been well documented in recent years. The conjecture here is that some of the crimes being attributed to black men back then weren't actually committed by black men, that they were the acts of, quote, black-faced brutes of the white race. Again, I'm not the first person to suggest that back in the day, white men could have used blackface as a cover for committing heinous crimes, essentially exploiting widespread racism to avoid ever being caught. Black people were saying it back then, but of course, no one was listening. It's not an outrageous claim if you think about it. After all, we know it happened, at least once. Between the Civil War and civil rights, we know that at least one person in the state of Georgia painted himself black and then tried to assault a woman. That person, of course, was W.H. Mitchell. With full certainty, we know that he planned and executed a sophisticated blackface plot to abduct a woman. And if he was bold enough to try it once, who's to say he wouldn't try it again? I mean, maybe the abduction of Lucille Linton was a trial run that just went horribly wrong. Maybe he learned lessons from that botched attempt, overhauled his strategy, and hatched a new plan to prey on other women, more women. In this episode, we're going to unpack my theory that William H. Mitchell was the Atlanta Ripper. We're going to be digging into the big questions. What did Mitchell do once his time in prison came to an end? Did Mitchell show signs of being some kind of psychopath or serial killer? What was that weird trip to South America all about? Did Mitchell have reasons to be in Atlanta? And finally, I'm going to reveal an eerie detail of that bizarre night that I didn't share in the last episode. We'll be exploring all that and a whole lot more. You're listening to episode 10 of CATLICK, The Mitchell Theory. Okay, here's your refresher on how the last episode ended. After a sensational trial that made statewide news, W.H. Mitchell was convicted of assaulting Lucille Linton. That happened, remember, in December of 1908. In the spring of 1909, his lawyers mounted a fierce appeal on his behalf. It failed. Their last hope was asking for clemency from the governor. That failed too. And so finally, in September of 1909, Mitchell began his year-long sentence on the chain gang. However, he never spent a single minute outside sweating alongside the other common criminals. His lawyers argued he was too sick for this kind of grueling chain gang labor. So he was sent instead to the state prison farm in a little town called Milledgeville, and he was confined to the hospital there. But he wasn't even there for that long. Mitchell was released early due to good behavior. That happened in July of 1910. And the papers reported that he immediately returned home to his family and farm in Thomasville. Now, this is when the details of Mitchell's life start to get pretty hazy. He doesn't completely drop off the map, but he kind of does. Before this whole fiasco, Mitchell was a very public figure. When you scan the Thomasville newspapers in the years before the abduction, he's everywhere. He's involved in civic life and business. You see his name pop up in the papers all the time. But after the abduction, it's totally different. There aren't really that many details of what he was doing then, but there are some. First, we know for certain he died in 1929 in Thomasville at the age of 67. I've tracked down his death certificate, and it looks like he just died of natural causes. Again, when the abduction happened in 1908, he was 46. This means he lived for 21 more years after that incident. So what happened during those 21 years? Well, here's what we know. Though his lawyers talked like he was on the brink of death when he got out of jail in the summer of 1910, he must not have been that bad off. By summer of the next year, 1911, he's quoted in the paper casually talking about his prosperous cantaloupe yield. Remember, he was a farmer before all this started. Between 1912 and 1914, he's mostly missing from the records. There are several mentions in the paper of him selling off some land. We also get a couple of mentions of his wife Lula visiting friends and family in other cities. It's sort of weird, but back then the papers would announce when local people were traveling. Here's an example from August 11th, 1914. Ms. W.H. Mitchell and Mrs. Margaret and Lula Mitchell are guests of Mr. and Ms. D.I. McIntyre in Atlanta. It's interesting to note here that every time the papers mentioned Ms. Mitchell traveling, W.H. is never with her. She's always alone. In July of 1915, Lula Mitchell suddenly dies. His wife was only 53 years old. A local news article said she died by, quote, an illness protracted through many weeks. It also notes that this illness was why she hadn't been seen in public lately. She was survived by her husband, W.H., and their 5 children. Between 1915 and his death in 1929, I've tracked down less than a dozen mentions of W.H. Mitchell. Here they are. In 1915, he was working with a group of local businessmen trying to get a canning plant in Thomasville. In 1916, he files a petition to charter a realty company with a partner and his daughter, Fraser. In 1917, he's listed as an attendee at a banquet with other local members of his college fraternity, Kappa Alpha Order. Then in 1918, and this is pretty weird, there's a 14-word advertisement in the want ads of one of the Thomasville papers. It reads, "For rent, the W.H. Mitchell dwelling, practically furnished. On Remington Avenue, Flowers Realty Co." Again, this is kind of unusual. He's 56, his wife is deceased, his kids are out of the house, and he's renting out his really nice home fully furnished. I guess we can assume he was living somewhere else, but we don't know where. Then in 1919, he sells some more land, and in 1921, his only son, T.C., comes to town to apparently help his aging father deal with some tax issues around his estate. But that's it. That's all we know. I tell you all this just to give you context for W.H. Mitchell's full life. Of course, the key time frame for our purposes was 1911 to 1914. That's when the Ripper was at his worst. Before we jump into my evidence for the Mitchell theory, we need to examine a key assumption of the police and media at the time. It was this: the Ripper murders are being committed by one black man living in Atlanta. 3 things: black, one man, living in Atlanta. Again, if we're going to chase the idea that the Ripper murders were being committed by a white guy a couple hundred miles away, we've got to first challenge these 3 core assumptions. First, were these murders committed by one person? Well, I've discussed this at length in previous episodes. While the police believed it was multiple black men, the consistency of these murders says otherwise. The victim pattern, women walking home from work late at night, as well as the way they were killed, bludgeoning followed by the throat being slashed, was too consistent to be multiple men. Most who've studied these murders agree this was the act of one person. The second assumption here is that the killer was black. Again, I've mentioned it, but this comes from the eyewitness testimony of 2 women who believed they escaped the wrath of the Ripper. They both said he was a black guy. He may have been, but he also may have been a white guy in blackface. It's highly unlikely that these women would have even considered this, especially since they were attacked in low light conditions and the guy was wearing a hat. Finally, it was assumed the killer lived in Atlanta. The problem with this is that the locations of the Ripper murders were all over the place. These murders happened all around the city, often miles apart. Remember, even 2 miles in 1911 is much further than it is today. Limited paved roads and few cars meant this killer would have been extremely mobile, but walking these long distances on foot. Also, this is inconsistent with how many serial killers operate. The pattern is to kill within a much smaller footprint. For example, the original Jack the Ripper, the guy who killed women in London in the 1880s, worked a relatively small area. All of his killings occurred in the Whitechapel district of London. Most historians believe he probably lived in that area and therefore was very familiar with the terrain. Most serial killers operate this way. The Atlanta Ripper followed no such pattern. He killed all over Atlanta's east side, on the west side, and even in the far northern suburb of Marietta. One pattern, of course, was that many of the bodies were found near rail lines. The locations of these murders are so haphazard, it suggests that this killer did not live in Atlanta. Remember, Atlanta was a railroad town with lots of passenger trains converging at downtown's terminal station. There was a constant flow of people in and out of the city and plenty of hotels in the city center to accommodate them. For a killer with the means to travel, Atlanta would have been an ideal city to set up shop. Also, one detail of the murders that the press identified was that many of them occurred on a Saturday night. There are lots of reasons why that could be. One of them is that the killer lived elsewhere, possibly worked a normal job, and then came into the big city of Atlanta on the weekends to satisfy his bloodlust. Furthermore, lots of passenger trains left out of Atlanta on Sunday mornings. And one of them had speedy access all the way to Thomasville. Okay, let's talk about W.H. Mitchell and ask a few more questions along the way. First, did W.H. Mitchell show any signs of being some kind of psychopath or serial murderer? This is the thing to establish before we discuss anything else. And the answer, of course, is yes. The Lucille Linton incident alone is reason enough to suspect this. Again, he sent fake telegrams dressed in blackface, lured a woman into the woods, built a booby-trapped torture shack, and then tried to choke her. These facts were clearly established throughout his trial and appeal process. Pretty much no one doubted he did these things. Oh yeah, and he most likely shot himself in an attempt to get sympathy. The other striking element of all this, the detailed planning. Going to Moultrie to send a fake telegram, buying the women's clothing in advance, painting himself black, retrofitting the shack with tripwires and peepholes. This was all a big, elaborate operation. Scientific American has a great article that breaks down the 5 myths about serial killers. One of those myths is that all serial killers are brilliant, evil geniuses with high IQs. The article debunks this myth, blaming this widespread belief on cooked-up Hollywood dramas. Alternatively, the data shows that most serial killers have average IQs. Here's a quote from the article. Quote, "Contrary to mythology, it is not high intelligence that makes serial killers successful. Instead, it is obsession, meticulous planning, and a cold-blooded, often psychopathic personality that enables serial killers to operate over long periods of time without detection." Meticulous planning. That's what it said. So while serial killers might not be geniuses, they do have to be meticulous planners to avoid getting caught. In this Lucille Linton situation, W.H. Mitchell certainly checks the box of planning and preparation. That same article notes another belief about serial killers, that they are all weird, isolated loners. That's another bogus belief, and the reality is that many of them are social and well-adjusted. From the article, quote, "Many serial killers are able to successfully hide out in plain sight for extended periods of time. Those who successfully blend in are typically also employed, have families and homes, and outwardly appear to be non-threatening, normal members of society. Because serial killers can appear to be so innocuous, they are often overlooked by law enforcement officials, as well as their own families and peers." End quote. A few other things to consider about this question of whether or not W.H. Mitchell fits the traditional profile of being a cold-blooded killer. Here they are. Judge Rohn, who presided over Mitchell's trial and had access to all the evidence, basically said W.H. Mitchell had some kind of fractured personality. He literally called him a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Also, don't forget that Lucille Linton was so scared of Mitchell, she left Thomasville and never returned. She moved to Athens, Georgia, 240 miles away. Linton also went on record saying that Mitchell should serve jail time, quote, "for the protection of the women of Georgia," end quote. Why would she say that unless she believed that Mitchell was capable of doing this again to another woman? Finally, and possibly most compelling, the pig incident. Remember when the Atlanta Constitution tracked down one of Mitchell's neighbors and told the story of Mitchell in his backyard shooting up a whole family of pigs? Well, lots of studies have linked cruelty to animals to the killing of people. Killing animals is often a rehearsal for the ultimate thrill of taking human lives. Before we move on from this question, I'll say one last thing here. In Mitchell's appeals, his attorneys argued aggressively that Mitchell was temporarily insane at the time of the abduction. The state argued the opposite, that he wasn't insane at all due to the level of planning and the countless character witnesses who vouched for Mitchell's good character. I've got to admit, this is one of the weirdest parts of this whole story, and I don't really know what to think. Mitchell's record was squeaky clean before he did this bizarre thing to Lucille Linton. We know that. Plus, dozens and dozens of respectable people testified in court that they'd known Mitchell for years and he'd never done anything like this. But let's imagine you were some kind of deviant with a desire to kill women. Let's imagine you live in a small town where everyone knew you. Let's imagine you finally work up the nerve to make your first kill and it goes horribly wrong. Doesn't it make sense that you'd look for a new location, a new killing ground? Somewhere far away, but close enough to get to in a day. Somewhere bigger, where you could blend in with the masses. Makes sense, doesn't it? Now, let's dive into a few more questions. Was W.H. Mitchell physically capable of carrying out the Atlanta Ripper murders? He certainly was. Again, he lived for 21 years after the Linton abduction. We know that within a year, he was back to farming. The Ripper murders happened from 1911 to 1914. Mitchell would have been aged between 49 and 53 then, certainly healthy enough to conspire, travel, and overpower women. Next, does the timing of all this line up for him to have committed the Ripper murders? Yeah, it absolutely does. His jail sentence was cut short in July of 1910. The Ripper murders began just 6 months later. Plenty of time to devise a new plot in a new city. Next, could he have traveled to Atlanta, and would that have even made sense? Yes and yes. As mentioned, there was easy and frequent train access from Thomasville to Atlanta and back again. We know Mitchell was a wealthy guy, so he could afford it. We also know Mitchell was an experienced traveler of rail lines. There are multiple documented trips of Mitchell traveling by rail to other cities in Georgia like Moultrie and Columbus, and we know he traveled to New York on several occasions. You gotta think, when Mitchell returned home from his time in jail, he must have been super ashamed of the whole affair. Here was a previously well-respected businessman who'd gone through this big, salacious, well-publicized trial. Pretty much everyone agreed or believed that he did what he did. No wonder the guy disappears from public life. He was embarrassed as hell, I would imagine. So again, assuming that W.H. Mitchell had a desire to harm women, it would make total sense that if he wanted to act that out, he's not going to do it in Thomasville where everyone is already a bit suspicious. Too risky. Furthermore, his plan only failed because he attacked a savvy, smart, wealthy white woman with a gun. Remember, if Linton doesn't pull out that gun and start screaming like crazy, the Good Samaritan farmer never comes to her aid. She would have been driven to that creepy shack where she'd have never been heard from again. Mitchell would have done whatever he intended to do to her, removed the black paint from his face, and quietly returned home. No one would have known a thing. His big mistake? Abducting a woman with power. Doesn't it then follow that if you still have this internal psychopathic drive to abduct or kill a woman, you just adjust your strategy? Instead of attacking a woman with power, I think you would attack a woman or women with little power. And arguably the most powerless social class in Georgia in 1911 would be poor black women, the preferred victims of the Atlanta Ripper. Perhaps you're thinking this. Well, BT, if Mitchell wanted to kill women in Atlanta, why couldn't he just do it as himself? Why would he need to put on blackface? Decent question. For one, letting a victim escape who saw you and identified you as a black man would feed right into the racist energy of the time. All it would take is the testimony of one escaped victim, and the police and media would latch onto the narrative that the killer was a bloodthirsty black man. Go figure. And that's exactly what happened. It would be the perfect plan for sustaining a multi-year killing spree. Furthermore, throughout his trial, the Atlanta papers printed several pictures of Mitchell. It's possible he feared being recognized, thus the need for the disguise. FYI, you can see photos of Mitchell inside the vault. Let's not forget, we actually have 2 known incidents where Mitchell wore disguises in public. The first, of course, was when he dressed as an old black woman to abduct Lucille Linton. The second, though, was lesser known and easy to miss. Remember when the Constitution quoted one of Mitchell's college buddies saying that in school, W.H. was known for dressing like a woman? Now, maybe this was just a silly prank amongst old friends, but the article also said that Mitchell had, at least on one occasion, been arrested for this. If you're having a goofy time with friends, maybe where everyone is wearing a costume and having drinks at the local saloon, you're not going to get arrested. I think we can assume here that when Mitchell got arrested for this, he was out in public, likely alone, doing who knows what. Again, that means we know of 2 occasions where Mitchell appeared in public in some kind of disguise or costume. Though this was highly unusual behavior for the time, he was apparently quite comfortable with it. And those are just the 2 incidents we know of. There could have been more. Now, it's worth addressing here another one of those misconceptions about serial killers. In the article I mentioned earlier, Scientific American says it's a myth that, quote, all serial killers travel widely and kill interstate, End quote. Relatively few serial killers travel around to commit their crimes. Most of them have a comfort zone they operate in that's often near their place of residence. It notes Ted Bundy as being an exception. A 2005 FBI report stated that while few serial killers commit their murders far from home, there are several commonalities amongst those who do kill over long distances. This is one of them. Quote, individuals whose job function lends itself to interstate or transnational travel, such as truck drivers or those in the military. End quote. In other words, people who work in the field of transportation. In the 1910s, the primary mode of transportation wasn't interstates. They didn't exist yet. It was rail. So, did Mitchell work in the rail industry? Yeah, he did. In the 1880s, when Mitchell was a much younger man, he was a part of a delegation of Thomasville men who traveled to Atlanta to advocate for Thomasville's interest in the Atlanta and Hawkinsville Railroad. In the 1890s, he was a part of another delegation who wanted to build a rail line to Tallahassee. And in 1906, Mitchell and some friends filed a charter to build the Thomasville and Gulf Railroad Company, which would later be renamed the Mexican Gulf Railroad Company. So yeah, W.H. Mitchell was actually a partner in a rail line just a few years before the Ripper murders began. He was in the transportation industry and incredibly comfortable with cross-state travel. Let's answer a few more key questions. Here's a big one. Did W.H. Mitchell have a reason to be in Atlanta during the time of the Ripper murders? While we don't know for sure if or how often Mitchell may have traveled to Atlanta during this time, we know for sure he had at least 3 clear reasons to go there. Number 1, we know Mitchell was a farmer and that in 1912, a local paper mentioned him selling cantaloupes. It's safe to assume that any produce Mitchell sold could have been exported to a large population center like Atlanta. It's easy to imagine him taking frequent trips to Atlanta for agricultural and business reasons. Second, we know that the Mitchells had close family friends in Atlanta. As mentioned earlier, the McIntyres had a home in Atlanta, and we know that from newspaper travel logs, they visited them there on occasion. Third, and most compelling, W.H. Mitchell had 2 half-brothers who lived in Atlanta at the time of the Ripper murders. One half-brother, Frank, was much younger than W.H. and was probably more like a son to him. In 1911, at the peak of the Ripper murders, Frank was a senior at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. His other half-brother, Joseph, also went to Georgia Tech. He was also much younger than W.H. We know that both of these guys lived in Atlanta until at least 1915. It's very possible the 50-ish-year-old W.H. would have made frequent solo trips to Atlanta to visit his 2 much younger half-brothers. Thomasville was a tiny farming community, and Atlanta was the nearest metropolis, so it's no stretch that W.H. Mitchell would have had multiple reasons to visit Atlanta. And it's also possible he concocted reasons to go to Atlanta alone during this time. No one would have questioned him or known what he actually did when he was there. Another big question. Did Mitchell's abduction of Linton track with the pattern of Atlanta Ripper killings? Well, yes and no. Yes, in that Mitchell attempted to harm a woman in a dark place on the outskirts of town. This is the exact same pattern as the Ripper. Virtually all the Ripper murders took place in a rural, dark area on the outskirts of town. No, in that Linton was white and the Ripper's victims were all black. However, throughout the media coverage of the Ripper murders, the papers noted a trend amongst the victims. Most of them were mulatto, which is a dated term for a light-skinned black person. Maybe Mitchell had a thing for light-skinned black women. But I also think it's plausible he just had a thirst to kill women. Any woman, regardless of race. And he figured out after the botched Linton abduction that it was easier to avoid getting caught by perping on working-class black women. Finally, there are 3 lingering mysteries for me. Here they are. Number 1, Mitchell's mysterious disappearance to South America. You may remember that in Mitchell's trial, Lucille Linton testified that he'd gone to South America some years earlier. The word she used was escaped. He tried to escape to South America, she said. In my research, I pinpointed the exact timing of this trip, and it was actually 2 separate trips. The first time was at the end of 1894. He was gone for 6 months, and he traveled alone. He then comes back in February of 1895, but then leaves again in April, just a few months later. He's gone this time for 13 months. Mitchell was much younger then, in his mid-30s, and he had 5 young kids at home. While he's gone, there are a couple of small mentions in the paper where his wife takes the 5 kids on some long trips to visit family. What on earth was W.H. Mitchell doing in South America alone while leaving his wife behind to take care of 5 kids? He was gone for nearly 2 years. It was mentioned in the papers that this travel was due to some business failings. We do know that Mitchell was a partner in a cigar company during this time. They set up operations in Thomasville and brought in scores of Cuban workers to roll the cigars. Mitchell actually traveled to Tampa himself to escort some of these workers to Thomasville. This all happened a few years before his mysterious disappearance to South America. Had this cigar company tanked, I might believe the story about him going south due to a failed business operation, but that wasn't the case. His company was thriving during that time, even years later. Here's another mystery. The removed shoes of the Atlanta Ripper victims. You may remember that on multiple occasions, the Atlanta Ripper removed the shoes of several victims, likely keeping them as sick trophies. If Mitchell had some kind of bizarre fixation on women's clothing, perhaps he enjoyed having these ladies' shoes as a perverse reminder of his evil act. The third and final mystery, and really the most intriguing of them all, is pretty wild. This is the detail from the night of Lucille Linton's abduction I did not mention in the last episode. I told you that the Mitchell trial got tons of news coverage. All the Atlanta papers covered the day-to-day proceedings of his trial with big, lengthy, detailed articles. Well, during the trial, a guy takes the stand by the name of Andrew McNath. McNath was a Thomasville resident, and on the night of the abduction, he was in the posse of men that set out into the night, searching for the old black woman who'd fled into the woods. McNath was actually the guy who discovered the bundle of women's clothing in the abandoned well in the front yard of the creepy shack. He testified in court that after he found those clothes in the well, he traveled with the rest of the posse to the Vashti house, which is where Miss Linton was being cared for. But then, he said, he went back to the creepy shack that night alone. He wanted to do a bit of investigating himself. When he arrived at the darkened shack, he discovered a set of unusually small footprints near the well. And this is pretty funny, but the Constitution article noted that at that exact moment, everyone in the courtroom turned to look at the feet of W.H. Mitchell. The writer observed that Mitchell did, in fact, have small feet. But then, while McNath is alone in the front yard of this abandoned shack, he hears a strange noise. I'll read the account exactly as it appeared in the Atlanta Constitution on December the 4th, 1908. Here it is. The witness said he found a towel in the well, but just about the time he fished it up, somebody whistled and he ran from the well and ran around the house. McNath, continuing his testimony, indicated that he was very much afraid of getting shot and constantly heard whistling and became alarmed. The next day, he returned to the well. Are you catching this? As this guy is alone in the woods investigating the well at night, he hears a whistle come from behind the house. He looks and doesn't see anyone. He then gets super freaked out, hears more strange whistling coming from the darkness, and then gets the hell out of there because he feels like this person hiding in the woods is about to kill him. This is crazy. The implication here is that Mitchell traveled back to the shack that night, was hiding in the woods and whistling in a creepy, weird attempt to get this guy to stop investigating the abandoned shack. Of course, if you've been paying close attention to CATLICK, you remember a certain whistling incident in the Ripper saga. The summer of 1911 saw the highest number of Ripper killings, one victim every Saturday night for several weeks. Well, in July, a young black woman is walking home from work one night when she hears someone whistling at the end of a dark alleyway. Within seconds, the figure is coming towards her in a menacing way. She turns, screams, and flees back to her place of work. Police are called, but the man in the alley got away. Mysterious whistling in the night in Thomasville and mysterious whistling in the night in Atlanta. Weird stuff. So there it is, the Mitchell theory. At the end of the day, the story of the Atlanta Ripper is a strange and frustrating one. We still don't know who killed these women so many years ago in Atlanta. What we do know is that it was a terrifying time to be a black woman in the city of Atlanta. We know the police and media could have done a much better job raising the alarm early on. We know race played a major part in how the entire episode was dealt with. We know the women who died weren't just names in newsprint. They were beautiful humans with rich stories who never deserved such a terrible fate. Maybe the killer really was the dual-minded W.H. Mitchell, traveling to Atlanta on the weekends, checking into a hotel, making his kill on Saturday night, and then quietly commuting back home on Sunday morning. Maybe it was a lone, deranged man actually living in Atlanta. Or maybe it really was multiple men committing all these murders. We may never know. Or maybe somewhere out there is a letter or a memento of some type, collecting dust in a basement or a forgotten cabinet in a government building that could unlock the answers to these questions. Or maybe some new technology will provide a new clue and bring some closure to this case that's baffled historians and criminal profilers for more than a century. History is a funny thing, and our understanding of it is never complete. Now, thanks for entertaining the Mitchell theory with me over the last 2 episodes. It was an unexpected departure from our 56-month historical timeline. In the next episode, we're going to pick up where we left off, in month number 21 of our story, September of 1912, to be exact. As the Ripper murders begin to fade from the Atlanta news, a brand new saga is about to explode. This one will happen far north of the city. As the Ripper was winding down his awful campaign of death in Atlanta, a brand new monster was about to make his first move, roaming the dense forests of rural North Georgia. Searching, stalking, hunting. It's a story of calamity and injustice and community panic that leads to terrible actions. Story number 2 begins with a heartbreaking tragedy and ends with a jaw-dropping resolution. All that next time on CATLICK. CATLICK is recorded in Atlanta's historic Cabbagetown neighborhood. Executive producer, Walnut Ridge Harmon. Original music and sound design by Duciel. Cover art by Rachel Eleanor. CATLICK store manager, Brett Harmon. CATLICK Instagram follower of the week, Vanessa Rivera. CATLICK Instagram commenter of the week, Jamie Moscato. Non-social media CATLICK fan of the week, Chase Sitton. And, back by popular request, the CATLICK hater of the week. It's reviewer R4DKR, who says that BT has annoying quirks and that, quote, this podcast is just way too slow and a bore to bother with. Thanks. CATLICK Twitter follower of the week is user B Newfang, who says, quote, CATLICK is the best podcast I've ever listened to. A dark historical podcast told in a genius storytelling format. Please do yourself a favor and give it a listen. That's much better. Don't forget, you can get all the visuals for this episode for free. It's a killer CATLICK Vault freebie. We've got a W.H. Mitchell timeline of events plus vintage photos of Mitchell himself. There is literally no reason not to check it out. Just dial up catlick.com/Atlanta Ripper. That's catlick.com/Atlanta Ripper. If you've got thoughts or tips or additional info on the Mitchell Theory, shoot us an email. That's themitchelltheory@gmail.com. themitchelltheory@gmail.com. And finally, CATLICK is independently written and produced by me, B.T. Harmon, signing off. I'd like to remind you to save old buildings, build bike lanes, and vote for public transit. We'll see you in the next episode.